Gentlemen, good afternoon. Once again, this is Srikanth Ramakrishnan. Thank you for joining today's webinar session. We would be recording the webinar for internal compliance process. Kindly post your questions on the panel that is displayed on the webinar. Today's topic is improve the strategic quotient of sourcing through analytics. If you look at it very carefully, you can see four different themes in today's topic. One is improvement, second is strategic quotient, third is sourcing, and fourth one is analytics. We would discuss thoroughly on all the four topics. A brief introduction about myself. My name is Srikanth Ramakrishnan. I would be the moderator for today's discussion. I have been working in the IT industry for more than 2 decades, largely focusing on IT delivery, managing center of excellences, and building large delivery teams driven by mostly IT transformation initiatives. Currently, I've been building and managing a partner ecosystem for Reinbrugger, through which we can provide cutting-edge solution to our esteemed customers in this region. So far, we have inducted nearly 6 partners in this ecosystem, and 4 more are in the process of incubation, totaling to 10 partners in Middle East region. We would be providing our industry-focused solutions through these channels, and partners would be empowered to do a successful business transformation to our end customers. Today's speaker is Mr. Vishwanathan. He heads the products development and analytics of Reinbrugger's technology division. He comes with more than 2 decades of industry experience and very strong know-how and grasp over technology products that leverages analytics to drive up value to the business. He's passionate about identifying business use cases that gets benefited by applying analytics and generate actionable insights for business. He has more than 2 decades of experience specifically in technology, out of which close to almost 1 decade has been spent on product development and analytics. That is core competency. Thank you very much, Vishwa, for joining today. How did you get into analytics? Just to start with, can you briefly touch up this particular point so that we can continue our discussion?
Thank you very much, Sri, for having me today. And I take this opportunity to kind of say thanks to all the guests dialing in from different time zones. I hope to have a very, should I say, very insightful session today. Coming back to your question, Sri, thanks again for asking, setting the context. After working in technology services industry for about a decade and a half, I should probably say I went through a midlife crisis and I wanted to do something on my own. And a partner of mine and I started a consumer sales analytics company, and then we were actually creating an analytics product, the use case for which he already worked in the previous career. And then that particular product was all about analyzing consumer sales and then coming up with a lot of insights. And that's how I got into analytics. And then as a logical extension, I got into technology product development, which consumes a lot of analytics and provide very meaningful insights. So that's a quick introduction about me from my side, Sri.
Fantastic. Thank you, Vishwa. Today's topic, as we briefly touched upon, is on improving strategic quotient on sourcing through analytics. So briefly, like 4 points and 4 elements we would like to touch today. And as a starting point, what is strategic sourcing and why would sourcing be strategic would be something I would like to ask on behalf of the audience. And also there were similar queries when I meet customers. What is so strategic about sourcing? That's what many of the procurement customers, they ask me. So please throw some light on this particular aspect.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get into analytics or improving the strategic quotient, it's very imperative that we understand what is strategic sourcing and why should strategy or why should sourcing be strategic, right? So it's very important that we understand that. There are many different versions of definitions of strategic sourcing, but if you look into all of them, there are a few key elements that kind of stand out. The first and foremost is strategic sourcing takes a very long-term perspective, right? contrary to tactical sourcing, which looks at each and every event, a sourcing event as independent entities, strategic sourcing really takes a very, very long-term perspective. So that's a very, very key element that stands out in all these definitions. The second element, in my opinion, is typically the sourcing is considered to be something that receives instructions from the business and executes in terms of cost savings or whatever it is, right? Whatever those objectives are. But strategic sourcing takes a different viewpoint. It becomes a little proactive, in terms of identifying and delivering value, and then taking a step further to kind of work towards mitigating the supply chain risks that are involved in the sourcing process through its own improvement of efficiency, of effectiveness of the sourcing function, right? So these are the two key elements, right? Long-term perspective and taking a proactive approach, right? In essentially what happens is, for you to be able to do that, strategic sourcing takes a very holistic look at the entire supply chain, starting from your suppliers, sometimes going up to this level 2 and level 3 suppliers in certain cases, and then the organizational business process that is involved in adding value to the business processes. Could be production, manufacturing, or it could be any other value added process. And in these processes, it also includes all the stakeholders that are involved in the process, whether they are from the supplying organization or the buying organizations or any logistical parties in between. And then it also ensures that all the spend categories are included in the process as much as possible, right? So when all these elements are said to be working, in full coherence, then sourcing is said to be very strategic in nature, right? So there are 4 key elements of strategic sourcing. The first one is your business value that gets delivered as part of that sourcing process, right? There's the business value at a very, very bare minimum is your spend and savings, but strategic sourcing goes beyond all that, in including the long-term sustainability of the entire ecosystem, right? So that is the business value. Number 2, as I said, it also includes all the suppliers and the sub-suppliers, etc. And the third element is basically the entire organizational process, the steps involved, and any strategy that needs to be adopted in each of these steps. And the fourth element, obviously, is the spend categories, because I don't think there is one organization which kind of effectively implements the same strategy across different categories. Each category, kind of demands a different strategy. So when all these elements are put together and they work kind of in tandem and coherence, the sourcing is said to be working at a very strategic level, and that's when I would prefer to call that sourcing function as a strategic sourcing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Now I realize one of the situation that I encountered, one of the implementations we did some time ago for a foundry and forging company. They had a boilerplate text in one of these components they were supplying for some of the shipbuilding companies in US. That's like a global shipbuilding company. So they were kind of talking like a horizon of a 15-20 years. The component needs to be available and the number needs to be tracked is something they were quite wanting, and I was kind of not very sure why would somebody want to know about this. And I now realize this long-term perspective you are carrying. So it's a different set of value chain, like the immediate supplier, the supplier thereafter, and how do you track the whole chain of supply. So that makes a lot of sense, Vishwa. Now this is quite interesting, and I understand the strategic sourcing is more like what you mentioned in terms of the business process. Probably a lot of risk management is also associated with that, because we have different layers of suppliers. There are geographical sensitivities, information system sensitivities, so many other things, a variability when they all bring the relationship into an ecosystem. But why do you think analytics is going to play, or is playing a key role in this strategic sourcing? That is something I would like to ask on behalf of our audience.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay. In fact, it's very important. Once we kind of understand, what is strategic sourcing. Obviously, for us to set the stage for the rest of the discussions, we need to understand what is the role played by analytics, and first of all, why analytics in strategic sourcing, right? So we need to clearly understand that. But for us to understand that, let's just take a step back and go back to what we discussed about, what strategic sourcing all about, right? We saw two key elements. The first one is that it takes a very long-term perspective. The second one is that it takes a very holistic perspective in terms of, kind of encompassing all the business processes, all the stakeholders, and all the steps that are involved in the business process, right? So these are the two key, takeaways that we had when we looked at, what is strategic sourcing, right? So let's look at each of them. When we say long-term perspective, right? What is a strategy that would work well in long term, right? Uh, I mean, companies have adopted different strategies in different instances, different scenarios. But if you have to just look back into the history, the one strategy that has always worked in the long term is actually continuous improvement and nothing else, right? So an organization cannot actually, define a very clear strategy and say, okay, this is the strategy that we are going to adopt for the rest of our, kind of put it in cast it in stone and then say, okay, this is what we are going to be doing for the rest of the life of the enterprise, right? So I don't think that's going to be possible. It was not possible in the near past. I don't think it's going to be possible ever in future, right? So which means the only strategy that is expected to work in the long term is actually continuous improvement, right? Let's keep that aside for a moment, right? So when you say holistic perspective, we are talking about too many elements playing together, right? Where are your suppliers? Who are your suppliers? Where are they coming from? What kind of categories are you actually sourcing? And what type of currencies are you sourcing? What type of payment terms are you using? Are there any logistics parties involved? And who are your customers? What are their project schedule? What kind of change management processes that they are going through? So if you look at all these things, it's just too many data points that are getting generated, right? So when you take the holistic perspective, obviously it is the natural outcome of the whole it's a natural outcome of the holistic perspective of strategic sourcing, right? So you put these two things together. At one side, you have too many data points that are actually getting created by the business process. At the other side, you actually need to have continuous improvement for you to be sustainable and successful in the long term, right? You just put together, these two are perfect raw materials for a clear, a successful analytics recipe, right? So you have the numbers, you need to have continuous improvement. Obviously the logical step is to kind of crunch the numbers and look for what can be improved, how can they be improved, right? And this is what exactly analytics does. And that is the reason why I feel for strategic sourcing to be successful and for sourcing to become strategic, first of all, analytics plays a very key role.
Fantastic.
Does it make
Yeah,
sense, Sri?
it absolutely makes sense. Yeah, the cohesion of these data points together work in a cohort way that helps the procurement to provide a insight to management, and also it helps in decision making aspects, which actually boils down to the next aspect. What kind of financial information, or should we speak the spend analytics? That's something we extensively hear about in this domain. And would you be able to touch upon this particular point? How do you think analytics can be applied for business processes as well? So if you can touch upon these two aspects, that would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there were two questions that you asked. The number one is the spend analytics, and number two is the business process. Out of these two, Sri, I think spend. Out of these two, items, Sri, spend analytics is a very common, I would say, a phenomena or a process that many organizations do. Essentially, it is about slicing and dicing your spend data across different dimensions, such as your time dimension, space dimension, could be your own category dimension, could be your suppliers, who are your top spending suppliers in a particular category, and all that, right? So these are typical applications or use cases of spend analysis, right? So this is something which is common. A lot of companies, a lot of enterprises do that, right? So but there are very specific use cases where we can actually take a little further, right? The same spend analytics, right, can be applied in a little different way. For example, as a chief sourcing officer, as a procurement officer, my desire, my goal would be to kind of spend more money with suppliers having higher rating and less money with suppliers having lower rating, right? That would possibly be what I would ideally like to have. So the question that kind of lingers in my mind as a chief sourcing officer would be, does my spend measure up to my supplier's rating, right? So how do I analyze this and how do I visualize it, right? So that's one of the key questions that are available. It's a little, I would say, it's a little advanced question that comes up once you have all your basic spend analytics done, right? So one way to do that could be, when you say suppliers rating, there could be different ratings, right? For example, suppliers are rated in terms of quality. Suppliers could be rated in terms of time for delivery, on-time delivery, maybe their technology innovation or engineering innovations, or could be, long-term savings potential, etc. Right? So based on your enterprise needs, you kind of put a weightage for each of them and then come up with a single rating, right? And then you come up with a number, which could be, let's say, a 1 to 10 scale or maybe 1 to 100 scale, depending on how flexible your data points are. And then you put that in the x-axis, in the horizontal axis, right? In this particular case, in the screenshot that you are seeing now, there is the x-axis which has the supplier rating, right? On the y-axis, you plot the spend that you have, right? Then you have a very beautiful 9-box model, which kind of very visually communicate in terms of, am I spending, more with suppliers with higher rating and less with suppliers with a lower rating, right? At the lower bottom of the screen, you see a particular case where there were some pockets of spend where, very high spend in a particular category, of course, very high spend with lower rating. Then you kind of get into analysis in terms of why did that happen? Who are those suppliers? What was the reason and all that, right? In certain cases, you may have to investigate. In certain cases, you may have to stop. And in the upper right side, you see example where there was typically there was some very small spend with suppliers with lower rating. Probably it happens. There was an exceptional case. We just had to make a decision to go ahead with supplier for a very, very specific case, right? So these are, some examples of some common example and a very, very specific use case of spend analytics, right? So that's, kind of my response to your first question. Okay. Now let's look at the second part of your question where you asked about business process, right? That's very, very important because, as I said, in the 4 elements of strategic sourcing, I said that the business process is also very, very important, right? So as a chief sourcing officer, again, right, which of my business processes are performing up to my expectations, right? My organizational expectations, and which of them are kind of, lagging, etc. So we can look at that as well, right? So in this particular, visualization, you put all your business processes on the outer areas. There could be 5, 6, 7, 8 number of business processes, and you set yourself some kind of a target for each of the business process. Like, for example, I should onboard a new supplier in about 4 days, right? I send an invite and I should be able to have all the information in about 4 days, right? Or it could be whenever whenever I publish a RFQ, I should create such a kind of relationship with my suppliers that they should have all the information and then they should be able to respond to that particular RFQ in about, let's say, 72 hours, right? Some of the business process steps may take a little longer. Some of them could be shorter. So you set your objectives in terms of what they are. In this particular case, the organizational objectives are actually shown by the darker blue line that is on the outer side. And as the business process gets executed, the system automatically captures in terms of what is the average time taken to take a new supplier onboarded, or what is the average time taken to get a response to RFQ, etc. So the system automatically plots all that. So in this particular case, you see a visualization where most of the business processes are kind of well within the target, whereas this one small business process called the non-preferred waiver, which is taking a little longer than what our target is. Typically, these non-preferred waivers are exceptional cases, so people tend to ask a lot of questions and get all the information before they kind of approve that, right? So it's quite expected that non-preferred waivers take time. So that's the kind of visualization you can see, some kind of an analytics that you can see, right? This is one example where very, very quickly the executives will be able to see how are my business processes performing against my own target? And we can drill down further to say, okay, why do non-preferred waivers take more time? Is that a process? Is that a problem with a category, or is that a problem with people, etc.? Right. So this is one way of looking at it. The other example could be, I talked about non-preferred, sourcing. Obviously, as a leader for sourcing, as a person responsible for sourcing, I would like to kind of reduce non-preferred sourcing as minimal as possible, right? So the question that lingers in my mind is the share of non-preferred sourcing very healthy, right? What is healthy could vary from organization to organization. So is it very healthy, right? So over a period of time, we will be able to see what is the ratio of non-preferred sourcing vis-a-vis the preferred sourcing, right? And then we probably tend to see a trend which is kind of converging to a minimal, but then in a particular year there was a increase in the percentage. So you will be able to drill down further and say, okay, is it again caused by a particular category, or was there any specific reason that's kind of out of control from our organization, right? So you can do these kind of analytics as well. So these are some of the examples where actually analytics can help you to identify the efficiency and the effectiveness of the business process itself more than the spend amount also.
Perfect.
Does that answer your question?
This is exciting. This is really exciting, because this typically looks like a fantastic orchestration actually in an organization processes. How somebody can do a what if by altering their payment terms, by setting up their non-preferred sourcing, and an optimal combination can be arrived so that the symphony is quite cohesive and conducive to the organization's growth overall. And they drill down to the entire organization's revenue per se, and how they establish a long-term perspective in terms of their sourcing strategy. So this is very, very insightful. Thank you very much, Vishwa.
Sure.
That boils down to our next, item in the stage in terms of what our audience want to ask. What do you think are the different stages in this enterprise goes through the journey for improving the strategic quotient of sourcing?
Yeah.
So, for example, we
so
probably set this at a different level. So, how do we plan the stages, and what is your recommendation for that?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, there are different, I would say, approaches. When you look at a typical analytics use case and how they get implemented in any business process, not just strategic sourcing, in any business processes, the textbook phases that are part of analytics is you crunch your numbers and then you find out what has happened, right? So they basically called insight. So what has happened, and then you go to the next step and then identify the correlations and causations between different factors, and then you kind of tend to answer the question in terms of why it happened. What factors or what parameters made that kind of a event or a result to happen, right? That's the second stage. The third stage is okay, if this is what has happened and this is why it has happened, then I have these factors. This is what is going to happen. This is what I'm predicting to be happening outside the organization. If this is what is going to happen for the factors, then what would happen to my result, right? So that kind of a prediction is called as predictive analytics. That's probably the third stage. The ultimate fourth stage is, probably the nirvana of analytics, is where you use the analytics and you start controlling the parameters in such a way that you will be able to prescribe to the business, saying, okay, if you do these things, you will get these results, right? This is called as the prescriptive analytics. So typically, this is how the analytics implementation journey looks like, right? So, but having said that, but when it comes to strategic sourcing, Sri, practically, this is what I see happening, right? The first and foremost is every organization kind of takes the first step to ensure that they consolidate and then gets the maximum out of the data that they have in possession, right? That's definitely in any organization that's probably been there for 20-30 years. There's a wealth of data that's available, except that it's all disparate. It's all distributed in different systems, and people have been looking at it, in isolation, right? So if you are able to meaningfully put them together, and then present it in a way that in a way that smart buyers will be able to kind of understand, they will immediately be able to pick up trends, right? So pick up correlations, right? So the first stage that any organization goes through is consolidating and leveraging the enterprise data that they have in their hand now. I still believe for many organizations, this is still a very, untapped potential. That's what my personal opinion and belief is, right? So once that stage is over, once you believe that, you have kind of leveraged everything that you have, then obviously the next stage is to kind of look outside, right? Look outside to see, for example, what are my competitors doing, right? Of course, you may have access to some syndicated data and other things. For example, we can look at, what does the commodity exchange say about the prices of commodities, right? Could be steel or plastic, or could be rubber or anything of that sort, right? So you start looking at that and say, okay, if this is how the commodity prices are going to be, then what is going to happen to my spend, right? So you can probably look at foreign exchange currency fluctuations and say, okay, if this is what I'm going to, if this is what is going to happen, what is going to be the impact on my spend and savings, right? Or you can look at some syndicated data, consolidated data of your customers and say, okay, sorry, your competitors, and say that, my competitor in this particular category is targeting to save 2.5% or maybe 3%. Maybe I should also target for that, or maybe something more than that, right? So these are all use cases, or maybe some specific examples where the organizations in the second stage, they kind of start using the data that's outside the organization for comparing and contrasting and for benchmarking purpose, right? So that's basically this stage number 2. Stage number 3 is once you have done both, once you have consumed all the data that you have, once you have consumed everything that you can put your hands on, then you don't have any data to consume. The logical step is to kind of say, okay, now that I do not have any other data to consume, how can I intelligently make use of the data that I have, both internal as external? That is where either infusing the intelligence comes into picture. That I think is the very third stage, right? So typically, this is a 3-step journey that organizations go through when they are implementing analytics specifically to strategic sourcing.
Very exciting.
Okay.
This is absolutely makes sense, because one of the events we kind of done here in Middle East is also connected with certain other events. They were talking about data is a new oil. That's what they were mentioning, and the importance of data was like extremely important, especially organization with historical data. Now, this stages you have mentioned here is also quite exciting. You have simple statistical models and other things can be performed, followed by mathematical models. As a final stage, you can also go for certain AI, artificial intelligence, or machine learning algorithms can be done, and probably organization can grow in line with that. So that is something quite exciting, and they can kind of take these things with proper AI ML related stuff, and maybe we should try to do a dedicated session on these topics separately. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think we should plan for that seriously, because there's a whole lot of data available, and it is definitely worth to do a separate session. How do we use a current contemporary technologies like a machine learning model or an artificial intelligence model around the acquired data once we do a statistical model or a mathematical model? So what do you suggest, Vishwa? I mean, how do you recommend for organization to go forward in that line?
Absolutely, Sri. I mean, it would be very exciting to have a session, especially with you on that subject, because you also have, significant exposure on that subject. On the AML side, there are, even though I said, it comes in the third stage as the final stage, I have seen some success stories of implementing, specific use cases when it comes to, usage of these kind of, computational algorithms, right? One use case, or one typical use case, which happens in many organizations, is spend categorization, right? For example, you have an organization history of 20, 30, 40 years, and you have been spending, but then you really want to take stock of it, and then you want to understand what has happened, what is our future strategy, etc. For that, you should be able to clearly analyze and then come up with these kind of patterns in terms of how did my spend across categories is, right? But unfortunately, you have those transactions and you have those items which were not categorized maybe 20, 30 years ago, right? So you have to now sit and categorize them. And sitting and categorizing them, let's say over a million set of data points or multi-million data points is going to be very, very challenging, right? So obviously, organizations will not have the bandwidth to do that manually. That's one use case where typically a machine learning algorithm is employed. There is a subject matter experts. They just kind of use a training set and say, okay, this is how the training set is categorized, and then they feed it to the algorithm. The algorithm says, okay, based on the training set, these are all the classifications that I could do perfectly, and probably there's a very, very small subset of 5, 10, 15% where the algorithm is not able to classify. Only that small subset is presented to users, and they kind of manually do the classification. So this kind of spend classifications is one use case where it's been very successful use case applying a machine learning model, even at the very beginning of the analytics journey, right? So it need not have to happen at the very, very end. It happens at the very, very beginning, right? That could be one use case. The other use case could be, for example, again, you have a 20, 30 years of history. People have been having items across the catalog. The catalog has been growing, and then people have been kind of left, right, center adding items to the catalog. And the same item or a part gets added multiple times with multiple names, and then now you are searching for a particular item or a part with a description, and then you realize that if you are restricting your search only to what exactly you entered, not many times it's going to be very useful results, right? So in these cases, a simple fuzzy based search can be employed, where it doesn't look for an exact match, it also looks for a fuzzy match, right? And then it gives you some kind of suggestions to say, okay, this is what you searched for. I'm not able to find an exact match, but here are the top 5 matches which I could find. I mean, this one is like 90% match, that can be 80%, 85%, etc., right? So these kind of fuzzy searches are very, very simpler to implement, but at the same time, they give you a lot of return on investment, right? So you will be able to have a very, very clean catalog, and it kind of improves the efficiency of the whole process, right? So these are all some of the use cases where simple implementations could give you a lot of return on investment, and these can be done even upfront in the analytics journey, right? Just wanted to highlight a few use cases.
Absolutely, because the master data management is probably a key, and even slightest variations kind of gets a separate entity, and a regular IT-based search is a little difficult. And this is a very interesting point. And something closer in a vector space can be measured, even if there is a dash or an underscore present in the front space. It is close to the vector space, and it will throw up the right results. That's very good, and I think it's worth doing a separate session on this. We will connect with this topic again for our esteemed audience available today. Do that,
absolutely. We will do that.
Definitely. Thank you, Vishwa. And moving to the next, discussion point here. Again, sorry for asking this question, but we need to have some clarity from you in terms of, do you think the analytics is different in direct sourcing compared with indirect sourcing? Of course, you tried explaining this, but again, for the choice for the audience, if you can throw some light, that will be helpful.
Absolutely, Sri. I just wanted to, I think you kind of inadvertently talked about this question at the very beginning, where you talked about, a ship, a part in the ship that kind of has a 20-30 year life, and then at the end of 30 years you need to replace that part, so you need to find out where the supplier is, etc., right? So that's a very, very classic example, right? So coming back to, let's just keep that in mind. I'll probably use that example. The question here is analytics different in strategic sourcing? I don't think it's different, but I believe it's a lot stronger, right? I firmly believe that sourcing has to be more strategic in direct sourcing than in indirect sourcing, right? basically because you are actually procuring parts and materials from your suppliers. You're putting that as part of your own product, and then you're putting it in the hands of your customers. And so, which means a part of your own company's take is with your suppliers, right? So there is a quality issue with those parts. Obviously, it's going to be construed as a quality issue with your product, right? And you also have to rely on your suppliers, not just at the time of sourcing, but for the entire lifetime of the product, right? So it's what it means is that sourcing has to be more strategic in direct than in indirect, right? So that way, I think it has to be a lot stronger rather than being different, right? Having said that, there are certain specific nuances of analytics and direct sourcing, right? One, one example which I wanted to throw here is, the analytics starts very, very early in direct sourcing, right? For example, contrary to indirect sourcing, the demand is in the form of, a bill of material or, some kind of a project requirement, right? So there's a very, very definitive demand. It's got a list of items or parts, and it's required at these places at these times, right? So that's called as the bill of material, right? And the moment you receive the bill of material, if you have been kind of repeatedly sourcing it, obviously you will have a history of sourcing. So you might want to just quickly look at your database and say, oh, you know what, so many items are already available with us. We are already sourcing them, right? So that could be the very first analytics step. The second step could be, for example, I find a part. This is the item that is required by engineering team. I do not have this. We are not sourcing it. However, if I told you strategic sourcing works proactively, right? So if there is a facility in which I can actually look for what is called as similar parts, right? No, I'm not able to find this part, but if there is a way by which I can actually find a part which is similar to this, and then go back to the engineering team, it could, the similarity could be, for example, it has a little different dimension, or it could be a little different raw material, or it could just be the color, right? Maybe the engineering team said we wanted it in blue, but I have it in, let's say, green or something, right? So if we can go back to the engineering team and suggest, what, engineering team, we don't have this part, but if we are able to replace it with this part, we already have a supplier, supplying this. So I will actually be able to go back to the supplier, increase the volume, because of which we will actually be able to have, better economy of scale, right? We may possibly be able to get a better price, or maybe we may just have a better mind share with that supplier, right? So we may get a better value eventually, right? So this could be a second use case which is very, very pertinent to direct sourcing, right? So essentially, the BOM analytics itself is very, very pertinent and specific use case to direct sourcing. The BOM obviously doesn't stay the same, stay stagnant for a longer period of time. It goes through changes. So another use case could be, how does the journey of my BOM price looks like, right? What has changed between, different phases of the entire program? What got added? What got deleted? What got modified? At each stage, what caused those changes, right? Was it an engineering change by the design team, or it could be a change in the supplier because of which we had to change the price, etc., right? So what are those root causes? Okay, so these kind of analytics are very, very pertinent to direct sourcing. So the short answer to your question, Sri, is they are not very different, but there are certain specific use cases which are very particular to direct sourcing scenario. Analytics, very, very specific to direct sourcing.
Sure. So sounds good. Thank you, Vishwa. Thank you for bringing this up, because the kind of inquiries or the audience that we have today probably are a mix. Some of them are from the direct sourcing, and most of them are from the indirect sourcing areas, basically. So I think that helps them to understand how this basically works. That brings to our next point. What do you think some of the key challenges in organizations implementing and extracting such insights to make sourcing strategic?
Good question. Very, very good question, Sri. In the past, there were several challenges. I should say different challenges, right? The first and foremost challenge is the simple, the sheer volume of data, the volume, the veracity, and the speed at which, the velocity at which the data comes, right? Just too much for organizations to handle, right? And obviously, the computational power that was required to handle this kind of volume of data at that speed was also a problem, right? These were traditional problems in the past, but all those problems are, of course, if the organization is kind of willing to invest in those kind of technologies, I'm pretty sure we have solutions, more than one solutions for all those problems, right? So they are actually becoming a little simpler to solve, provided the right investments are made in the right areas, right? So that's the older set. However, in my opinion, there is one important problem that's kind of yet to be addressed very, very effectively, is that there is an analytics solution that kind of crunches the numbers and then comes up with actionable insights, right? But the challenge is the systems where the business process gets executed and the systems that are used for analytics are two different systems, because of which there is no, I mean, the speed at which the data gets synchronized is not very great, right? So by the time the analytics crunches the data and comes up with the so-called actionable insights, right? The quote unquote actionable insights, they are no longer actionable, right? They are hardly actionable because they are based on some outdated data, right? You take it and you start analyzing, and then you realize that the world has changed so much in the last 1 month that a lot of things have changed, so they are not actionable, right? So this challenge of ability to create, right, actionable insights or analytics happen in near real time, I think that's one challenge that is yet to be addressed, right? For that to happen, we need to have a very holistic system, in which the business process automation and the analytics are together, right? And there are a couple of reasons why they need to be together. The first one is what I told you, right? Then the data can be crunched, or the analytics can be done immediately after the data gets into the system, right? That's one way to do that. The other important point, which we should not forget, is this, right? We talked about continuous improvement at the very, very beginning, right? So obviously, in the long term, the business process has to continuously improve. The analytics also has to continuously improve, right? But for the analytics to continuously improve, it needs additional data points, right? It needs additional dimensions to be captured, right? While it needs additional dimensions to be captured, if the system which executes the business process is also kind of built along with it, the business process can be modified to kind of enforce, to capture those additional points, right? So the improvements can go hand in hand, right? That's a very, very significant advantage when you have a system which has both the business process as well as analytics, right? So I think that's one problem where, making the analytics happen in real time and then, placing the insights for action so that, the actions can be very, very immediate, is what the challenge I think is yet to be addressed in several scenarios. So in my opinion, I think that's one challenge that has to be addressed.
That's absolutely fine, and I could see many places during our implementation days or even during consulting days, people have this notion to bring everything under one umbrella, and it's like one single instance of a database. We want to have a centralized approach, and probably when you try to extract a report, somebody would be trying to create a sales order, and the whole thing is going to be slowing down like anything. So it's not people would think this like a very small aspect, but actually this is where the entire organization's central nervous system is going to lie down. Your transaction processing system and your analytics are to be dealt in a very sanctimonious way. Each should be complementing, and they should not be, what you call, dependent on each other. However, both of them have their own space, so that enterprise IT caters to two different set of people in a very justified manner. Actually, maybe a managing director or a CEO might be viewing a dashboard probably once in a day, and immediately a report should come or a dashboard should come for him. At the same time, somebody on the account payable department should be able to process the invoice without much of a dependency on what is a load of report being generated in the financial controller's office. So this is a very important point you touched upon, Vishwa. Thank you very much. I would probably speak a very brief point about Reinbrugger. Take probably 3-4 minutes. Thereafter, we would take the questions. So request the audience to post their questions on the panel that is displayed on the system. We, Reinbrugger, are a global company with a strong presence in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. We believe we change the status quo and grow by providing innovative solutions. We are constantly focused on mid-market with a strong multicultural and multilingual team that understands your regional needs. We believe that a business can achieve the desired performance when IT is aligned to business strategy and operational business needs. Delivering value to your business is mandate of every CIO and IT organization. We create truly unique value proposition through our cutting edge solutions that leverage global cost models and best-in-class service by local experts. That's what at Reinbrugger we do, and we have 4 different delivery pillars to achieve this. Next slide, please. And in this particular delivery model, we have our first pillar, cloud ERP. Second pillar is product development that we do on our own. We have product development department, and third is surround IT. Fourth pillar is our consulting and advisory. The first pillar, we do cloud over, ERP over cloud, and Reinbrugger is an Epicor Platinum partner, 2 times winner of International Partner of the Year. We have immense experience in expertise in providing Epicor implementation and support services to our global customers. Talking about the second pillar, this is where we do our product development. So far, what has been discussed here, we tried addressing the industry problem, and we have arrived at a product called Merlin, which is primarily for strategic sourcing, and currently the modules have been built and being released in this particular market for indirect sourcing as well. And we have a very thorough strategic sourcing solution that is completely seamlessly integrated with sourcing process automation, along with supplier relationship management and the planning functions. They are thoroughly augmented by advanced analytics and artificial intelligence. Definitely over a few aspects we touched upon, like natural language processing, in terms of how they work seamlessly with their database and all of the queries that is discussed here. It also plays a very pivotal role in enhancing collaboration between your buyers and suppliers through an intuitive platform, having certain components like auction engines, different varieties of auction engines, and a very nice collaborative platform, a beautiful web-enabled platform. We do that. And the second product we offer is called Bruka. It is a collaboration between employee community, especially in the current business context, where empowering the employees to work from virtual office. The third product we offer is Expensa, which is an expense management solution over the cloud. It can be accessed using a browser. It can be accessed using iOS or an Android platform. It can be done using a mobile platform. And that's about our second pillar, which is pure play product development pillar. The third pillar we have is connecting the enterprise together, which is surround IT. And we are a certified Microsoft Gold partner, delivering solutions in the space of IoT, BI, e-commerce portals, B2B as well as B2C. Web and mobile applications are also being developed in this particular pillar of center of excellence, basically. The fourth pillar that we have is consulting and advisory services, wherein we leverage our industry experts and supply chain management professionals across the globe, and we also provide IT rationalization and portfolio optimization as a part of this particular delivery excellence. We would take the questions. Actually, we have questions posted by our audience, and Vishwa, I would request your help to pick these questions. I would read these questions one by one, and we can go over them.
Please.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. The first question today is from Niveta. This is a very interesting question. How can we understand where the delays are happening in the system? Can analytics help with that? That's the first question. Thank you, Niveta, for asking the question.
Absolutely. So we kind of touched upon this when we talked about the business process efficiency, right? So, typically when you say delay, the delay can be of multiple reasons, right? So one could be the non-availability of people, etc. The second could be non-availability of information for people to take appropriate decisions, right? Or just the non-availability of stakeholders to be able to respond to ad hoc questions. So what typically happens is, you kind of run a report and say, okay, these are the different steps that had happened. These are the people who did that. And then you kind of get to see what is the average time taken. There are reports like, for example, a user sign-off report, which can be used to find out what is the average time taken, right? But the way in which analytics can help specifically is, whenever somebody is making a decision in terms of, either rejecting it or taking time, you kind of, let the person say, what is the reason? You kind of define a set of reason codes and say, what is the reason? Is it lack of information or lack of people or lack of collaboration or any other reason that the enterprise needs, right? So you kind of classify them, and then you do a slicing and dicing across business processes, across reasons, across departments, and then try to identify what are the most prominent reasons for which things are getting delayed, and then you start addressing them both proactively and reactively, right? So that's typically how analytics used to kind of improve the business process.
Thank you, Vishwa. Question number 2. This is from Gauri. Thank you, Gauri, for the question. Is it possible to identify if we are losing money due to currency rate differences?
Yeah, absolutely. So this kind of falls into the area of what is called as what if analytics, right? So when you have when you have done your slicing and dicing of spend across different let's say currencies, then what you do is you take out a particular currency, let's say for example Japanese yen, and then you kind of project on top of it to say, okay, instead of Japanese yen, what if I had paid in US dollar, for example, in my own currency, right? Because there's a lot of fluctuation that's happening between USD and Japanese yen, for example, right? So I take that and I kind of project it and say, what if I paid it in US dollar? So the system will then be able to say, oh, okay, if you had paid it in US dollar, this is what you would have paid, and this would be the impact on your spend and savings. Okay, so that's how typically analytics help by kind of simulating what if scenarios, and then you can take a step further and then look at your forex projections and predictions and say, oh, you know what, I'm expecting this fluctuation to continue or become worse. Then probably you take a step or get into a discussion with your suppliers and say, instead of one particular currency, we will shift the payment to another currency, right? So that's how typically analytics is used to identify if you are losing money, or if we will be able to gain money if we change the payment currencies.
Perfect. Thank you, Vishwa. That's very interesting, and there's a whole lot of mechanisms in terms of hedging this against if the exposure is very high.
Absolutely.
There are large enterprises who monitor that. That's a very big area. Thank you, Vishwa. The third question is, how do you think analytics could help in mitigating supplier risks? This is a question from Durai. Thank you, Durai, for this question.
Yeah. I think that's a very, very interesting subject, especially in today's situation, right? The pandemic situation. It's a very, very, very pertinent question. I was just thinking that we didn't cover it as part of the discussion, but I think it just come very timely. Okay, for us to understand how analytics can help in supplier risk management, we have to first of all take a step back and then understand what are the reasons for the manifestation of supplier risk, right? The first one is that everything is good, there's a very fantastic supplier, and then over a period of time I've been sourcing a lot from these suppliers, and then I realized that today let's say 30-40% of a particular category comes from the supplier, right? There's just too much of dependency on that particular supplier, right? So that could be one risk, supplier risk, right? So in the way analytics can help is, whenever you make a sourcing decision, you look at what is the share of business of that particular supplier under that category. You set yourself a target to say, okay, no supplier will go beyond an X percentage, could be 20, 25, 30% of share of business under a particular category, right? And if a buyer is actually trying to make a decision to kind of go beyond that, then of course you kind of alert, and then you make the system to go through some additional approvals and all that. So that could be one way that risk can be maintained. The other way could be, for example, when we look at a specific legal entity, there is no issue. But then there are 25 legal entities under a parent company, and then when you put all of them together, the dependency or the share of business of that parent company is actually 20-30%, right? But when you look at the legal entities, they are like 1 or 1.5%. That could also be the situation, right? And this is especially where the business process analytics actually working together will be a very good idea, because for this to be managed effectively, you need to have proper hierarchy in your suppliers, right? So you should be able to kind of club those legal entities under a particular supplier group, and you should also have the ability to do the spend analytics both at the legal entity level as well as at the group level, right? So you take one step forward, and then when you look at the group level, then you will be able to see the risk, right? So this is another risk. The third risk could be, for example, they are just legal entities, they're all independent companies, fantastic, but for certain reasons over a period of time, those suppliers kind of are kind of concentrated in a very, very specific region, right? So in a specific country, in a coastal area or something like that. So, and then some kind of a natural disaster or something happens, and then you are in trouble, right? So an analytics which actually will give you visually what is going from where to where within a particular category, right? These kind of analytics will be able to very clearly tell you, am I running a risk of the concentration of suppliers in a specific region, right? That could be another way supplier risk can be analyzed, right? In fact, in certain cases, people have also gone to the level to say that there are completely different legal entities. They're all operating there as separate companies. But then if I have to go back to the outside data and look at, let's say, for example, their listing data or their enterprise data of those suppliers, then I realize that even though they are 20 different companies, they are all managed by the same promoter, or maybe the same investor, or maybe the same leadership, right? So in which case, your typical spend analytics will not throw any light or will not give you any red signals, but your ability to start using the syndicated data will give you some analytics in terms of saying, oh, you know what, they're all fine, but if something happens to those promoters, investor, leadership, etc., you are actually running a trouble, right? So these are all different ways in which analytics can help you to identify supplier risk, and then obviously take steps proactively and reactively.
Great, thank you. This is another interesting question. It's a small question, but I would like to take this. How difficult it is to implement such systems in large enterprise? This is from Varshni. Thank you, Varshni, for the question.
It depends. It depends on the enterprise maturity, Sri. The way I would look at it is like this. First of all, obviously we are not obviously talking about starting a new company and putting these systems in process. We are talking about an organization which has been there for 2-3 decades. How we are trying to get into it, right? So the cleanup of the existing processes, the cleanup of the existing data is the very first step, right? As long as that step is executed very cleverly, right, with the expectation that we are going to overlay a system on top of this, the existing data, And then keeping in mind that we are going to have one single system which will encompass both the business process execution, the transaction, as well as the analytics, right? Obviously, the starting point for all these systems is existing data, right? So as long as we are able to cleverly and clearly articulate that, and then take steps to ensure that what goes into the system is kind of clean and neat, I think implementation of these kind of systems is not very complicated, but a lot depends on how prepared the enterprise is in terms of having a very clean data, structured data available to be fed in at the beginning of the implementation.
Good, thank you, Vishwa. We'll probably take one more question. There's a last question of the day. We use direct sourcing. Many components come from many different suppliers. Is it possible to identify which supplier supplies what and where and at what price? This is a question from Flynn Toy. Thank you, Flynn.
Absolutely. I think it's a very, very bare minimum standard. For you to be able to, say, I do analytics, I do strategic sourcing, I think it's very, basic, I would say, a parameter to be met, which is what is typically called as the price list, right? A price list which says, okay, I'm actually, I have a contract to purchase this material from this supplier between these effective dates, right? Because strategic sourcing is long term. So you may also want to go to the extent of actually collecting not only the present price, but also the future price, right? So with specific effective dates, if you are able to maintain a price list, that would be very fantastic. But I think, it's kind of a starting point for making sourcing very strategic.
Great. Thank you, Vishwa. Thanks a lot for your insightful session today. I also thank you for the audience for great questions and very enthusiastic participation. Watch the space. We would make this recording available to you over the YouTube channel, and watch Ryan Brugger's space in the social media for upcoming webinars. And we truly believe in providing dissemination, knowledge dissemination to our ecosystem in a very effective way. So watch the space for technology related changes, trends, and other stuff. Thank you very much for your participation today. Have a good evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Sri, and thank you very much for our guests as well. Looking forward to talking to you later. Thank you.
Thank you.